You're listening to Freedom Daily, presented by the Freedom Foundation. Freedom Foundation is a nonprofit, nonpartisan political think and action tank dedicated to individual liberty, free enterprise, and limited accountable government. Enjoy the show.
Well, hello, folks. It's always a delight to get to talk to you and to let you see a glimpse of the work that we do here at the Freedom Foundation, but also work that's going on all around the country. The work that we're doing, of course, is to make Washington a better reflection of the important values of individual liberty, free enterprise system, and accountable government, which does a few things well rather than trying to be everything to everybody. And I want to encourage you to get our free introductory offer subscription to our newsletter. You could call and ask for yours at this phone number, 360-956-3482. We'll talk about that again at the break, and you can grab that phone number at that time as well if you missed it this time. If you already get our newsletter and one of our thousands of members of the Freedom Foundation, I want to let you know that I'm grateful for you being a part of our team and helping us to create a better future for Washington. It is a delight to get to talk to you, but it's also a delight to get to bring guests on to the show, and I really enjoy getting to explore what's going on in other places and give you sort of an insight on that as well. And I'm excited about my guest today, who is the president of the Americans for Limited Government Foundation, and his name is Nathan Mehrens. Nathan, thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you for having me.
Yeah, and one of the things, of course, that struck my interest about your organization is a project that you have underway called SEIU Monitor. And SEIU, standing for the Service Employees International Union, and the Freedom Foundation has seen fit to work on curbing the excesses of the SEIU in our own state, where they're taking advantage of people in the home health industry and in the child care industry. And so we've done some work on informing folks of their rights, and lo and behold, your organization is seeing fit to do the same thing. How did that... Well, first tell me a bit about the Americans for Limited Government Foundation.
Sure. We're a national organization. We've been around for about 12 years, and we focus on primarily on fiscal policy issues. We also do a lot of regulatory work. We have a strong emphasis on labor law. Several of our staff here have significant background in labor. I myself was at the U.S. Department of Labor for several years working on union issues, and so we have a lot of experience in that area. We write a lot about fiscal policy, monetary policy, tax issues, and the like. So
tell us a bit about the connection between limited government and labor organizations. I mean, I have a sense of it, but what was the conclusion that you'd reached on that?
Sure. Well, labor organizations, especially those that have members in the public sector, are a very large factor in the growth and expansion of government at all levels. They are the driving force behind increasing the scope of government, increasing the number of employees at every level of government, be that from your local municipality all the way up to the federal government. And so we've taken it upon ourselves to try and keep an eye on what some of these unions are doing in that respect, trying to expose some of the tactics that they use, and showing how that this is one way that an outside entity is increasing the size and scope of government, and correspondingly increasing your tax burden.
Right. So Americans for Limited Government would obviously have as a core mission something like curtailing the growth, expansion of government. That stands to reason. So what sort of work are you doing? Is it primarily national focus, or do you look at states all over, or what's the nature of the work that Limited Government Foundation does?
Most of our work is national in focus. Every once in a while, we'll pick up an issue that relates to a state, but the vast majority of the work that we do does have a national focus. Yes.
Okay, and then do you have a publication, or how can somebody track or pay attention to the work that you're doing?
Sure. The best way to keep in touch with us and follow what we're doing is through our website, netrightdaily.com. That's our blog. It has original editorial comment that we post every single day. You can sign up for our email list there and get it straight into your inbox. You can also follow our Facebook page, which is linked on there, and we have a pretty wide following there. We send out commentary on various issues, everything from what Congress happens to be doing at a particular moment to regulatory things that the Obama administration is doing, and everything in between.
All right, and then the SEIU monitor is just a piece of the larger work that you do. Am I getting that right?
That's correct. Yes.
All right. And so you picked up the SEIU. What's the reason that SEIU was the one selected for a particular focus?
Well, they're one of the larger unions out there, in terms of gross numbers. They have just under 1.9 million members. They've also been one of the more aggressive unions in terms of organizing tactics and finding new ways to keep people paying money to them. Mm-hmm. They also have a significant public sector presence, mm-hmm. Which, as I mentioned earlier, drives the growth of government, or at least impairs the ability of organizations like ours to achieve change in shrinking the size and scope of government.
Right.
So for those reasons, we've chosen to keep an eye on them.
And their growth has been in that public sector area. They've been losing ground on the private sector side, but in our state, I can certainly say they did a real clever initiative to the people that says, do you think old people should be taken care of? Vote yes. And then, oh, by the way, that means that we're going to unionize everybody who is a relative or a family member or anybody who's getting any Medicaid reimbursement. And so it ends up being a racket for, as you were saying, their cash flow. I mean, they really seem to operate like drawing money into the coffers of SEIU is the point, and by any means possible. So now, I see your mission statement related to this project, the SEIU Monitor. Our goal is to provide a critical look at the practices of the SEIU by bringing members the latest updates from SEIU along with commentary and opinion that's engaging and informative, and that you are watching the Service Employees International Union for dirty tactics, scandals, shady lobbying, and union mismanagement, all of which we certainly have seen elements of here in Washington State. But again, that mission, where does that come from?
Well, again, that's kind of things that we've seen, as problem areas for them over the years.
Right.
I've personally been following them for more than a decade in various different roles. And when we were at the Labor Department, one of the responsibilities that I had was working on the financial reporting regulations that apply to them and most other unions that have a private sector
to the extent
component.
that they do. Yeah, they have to have that private sector component, and that's always frustrated me because I deal quite a bit in education policy with the Washington Education Association, and they have no reporting obligations. And then when we try to propose legislation to the legislature, they act like we're bringing the end of the world to them. I'm like, well, all the private sector ones already do this, but throw a big fit. So you were involved on the regulatory side related to reporting, union reporting.
That's correct, yes.
Oh,
I was heavily involved in that, wrote a number of the regulations that are in force today, the reports that unions file, the conflict of interest reports that their officers and employees file as well.
Mm-hmm. Now, this particular union, SEIU, is creeping into a host of different areas. One example, I got a call just within the last week from a professor at the University of Washington, because, as you know, professors are an exploited class who need somebody to step in and help them navigate the issues of employment. And so SEIU is aggressively trying to unionize them. Again, it's a public sector employment role, and but they're trying to make the case, and this professor was saying, who is the SEIU? Who do they actually represent? And what would be, I sort of fished out an answer for him and discovered it's everybody from anything to anything just about. But is that common across the country, or?
Yes, it definitely is. They have, in today's world, they're needing to look for new sources of revenue in order to keep the infrastructure in place that they've had for decades. Mm-hmm. So one of the ways that they're doing that is, looking for new types of employees to unionize, kind of getting away from the traditional, as their name suggests, service employees, and getting into more white-collar areas in some instances. And at other times, they're looking into whole industries that have not traditionally been unionized, such as the fast food industry. They are highly involved in all of the efforts to increase the minimum wage and unionize fast food establishments and the like. They've been a big supporter of the Fast Food Forward movement, the Fight for 15.
Financial supporters of those things.
Definitely financial, as well as boots on the ground support.
Providing the staffing for it, Yeah, no, and that's been our experience as we've seen. Washington, of course, is one of the hotbeds of some of these more forward edge, bleeding edge of progressive values, borderline socialism coming to Seattle with the 15 Now efforts, and these sort of unusual forms of unionizations that have taken place in our state. And SEIU is a big player in that, and it's been frustrating because it just grows and spreads, and there's no accountability. So, I mean, what's what are there any consumer protections for people who are having to fund activists to go protest in front of McDonald's?
Well, it's kind of a complicated question, and the answer is a little complicated too. It depends, like a lot of legal answers, on whether you're dealing with a union that is wholly public sector or if it has private sector components. If it has private sector components, then there are protections built into federal law for the money that comes out of your paycheck to pay for the union and how that's supposed to be spent. In that instance, the union has a fiduciary obligation to its members to spend its money for the exclusive benefit of those members. And in some instances, there's a cause of action for a member to seek redress if an expenditure does breach that fiduciary obligation. It's a difficult road to hoe. It is possible to go there, but it's
so as a member, because I know non-members of unions, those who choose to opt out and to say, no, I'm going to only pay for workplace representation, there's a certain measure of accountability along those lines. But are you saying that members also have some rights, at least in a private sector union? I know the public sector is lacking these things.
Right. Yeah, the statute says that the money shall be spent for the exclusive benefit of the members and the organization. So if they're going off and spending money on a whole bunch of peripheral things that have no reasonable nexus to representing the employees to the employer regarding the terms and conditions of employment, which is the full ostensible purpose of a labor organization, then a case can be made that they are breaching their fiduciary obligations to those members.
Now, does that ever happen? It doesn't. I certainly haven't heard of any cases of that, but I'm maybe not paying close enough attention.
It does happen from time to time. It's one of those things that you would have to have a member that was really dedicated to rooting out this kind of problem, because they're going to be at risk for reprisal from the union, and in some instances,
and documentation
risking their livelihood.
Documentation is so hard to come by in this area anyway that it would be difficult to prove that the dollars that I contributed as a member of, say, a hospital employees union to SEIU was actually used to buy activists to go in and to disrupt Walmart or something like that. Tracking the actual dollars would be a burden that I imagine would be very difficult to overcome.
At the end of the year, you could see from their financial reports some information if they, for instance, spent money on a vendor to support that kind of activity. You would be able to see that. But in terms of a lot of the expenditures there, it would be difficult to trace that to an individual incident, that's for sure, yes.
All right. Well, listen, we've got to take a break for a bit, but don't go away, folks. We will be back to talk more with Nathan Mehrens, the president of Americans for Limited Government.
Most Americans don't like being told what to do, yet many government employees are forced to pay dues to a union or lose their job. Government union monopolies spend millions on politics, regardless of whether their members support the cause or the candidate. This undue influence from union bosses forces all of us to pay higher taxes to support an ever-growing and bloated government. Had enough? So have we. The Freedom Foundation is working to reverse the stranglehold public sector unions have on our government. Want to join the fight? By supporting the Freedom Foundation, you help us to level the playing field and end the tyranny of government union bosses in Washington state. Go to myfreedomfoundation.com to learn more. That's myfreedomfoundation.com. Or to sign up for a free subscription to our monthly newsletter, call 1-800-769-6617. Once again, the number is 1-800-769-6617.
You're listening to Freedom Daily, presented by the Freedom Foundation.
And I'm your host, Jamie Lund, today, and my guest is Nathan Mehrens. He's the president of Americans for Limited Government Foundation, and they've got this project called SEIU Monitor, and if you've listened to this program, you know the Freedom Foundation has also struggled with the undue influence that the SEIU has in Washington State to impact the cost of government and to impact even economic freedoms of people. And so it's intriguing. We were talking just before the break about the kinds of accountabilities that are possible for folks who are in a union arrangement. And you were saying before that there is some element of a fiduciary responsibility that unions have if you can prove it, if you can document it, and if you're not afraid of whatever reprisals might come of that. Are there any other forms of accountability that unions, duties they have to their members or to the public?
If a union expenditure is not properly authorized, such as if it's an embezzlement or something like that, then the U.S. Department of Labor has jurisdiction to prosecute union officers that steal money from their members.
That doesn't happen, though, does it?
It does.
Like any organization, I suppose, but I have seen quite a few headlines in that. Is that something that you pay attention to as an organization?
Oh, sure. Yeah. It's a fairly constant thing, actually. On average, the Labor Department gets about 10 convictions a month of union officers that are stealing money from the union. That's not stealing money from an organization again. Stealing money from the individual employee who is paying money to that organization, oftentimes not necessarily of their own free will,
right?
Just because of the arrangement that they have with their job and how that works. So, yes, no, this it definitely happens. So more than 100 a year, sometimes as much as 150 a year. Union officers are convicted of crimes in this manner.
Huh. And so the federal government is at least looking at that with regard to private sector, because I know they don't look at it with regard to purely public sector.
That's correct.
Okay.
But if the union has one private sector member at all in the entire hierarchy, then every union above that local would be covered as well, and that's why SEIU, even though it has a very strong public sector presence, is covered because it has a private sector component as well.
And traditionally it was a private sector union. I mean, the service employees was always private sector folks. Maybe some hospital folks was a sort of an early part for them. But now, of course, I've seen they represent doctors, they represent professionals of all different stripes, because pretty much wherever the public money is easy money. And especially if they're able to use their political influence to secure that. And we've seen a lot of that in Washington, of course.
And I think one of the things that they've done over the last few years, with some success in areas, is to look for different classes of employees that don't necessarily need them at all. And so what you end up with is a situation where money is coming in from those employees, but the union doesn't necessarily have to engage in any expenditures to do any sort of representational activities on behalf of those employees.
Well, one good example, I was looking at the SEIU contract for child care providers. We have home-based businesses that offer child care services, and it used to be daycares, but now, of course, we're in the 21st century, we call them early learning centers, but it's the same people doing the same job. And in the contract, the grievance part, which is generally the core of what unions are supposed to do, is sort of troubleshoot on behalf of employees with their employer. Well, these are sole proprietors. These are small business people who are operating a daycare. There is no employer. And yet the contract language was like, well, here, first thing you do is you call the accounting office of the state, and here's their phone number. That was their step one in their grievance process, was call the people who pay you. So it's like, oh, okay. And how often does that happen exactly? So you're right. They don't have to do the traditional work, and yet they're still taking a good chunk of money to provide workplace representation, even though there's no workplace. So
yes, no, it's a great deal if you can get it. I don't know of any other areas where you can come up with that kind of deal and make it work. Yes.
Yeah. Well, and it does hang significantly on their political activities, and that's a piece of what they do where their investment, maybe they've doubled down on that in recent years. Is that the trend? I mean, do we see, what historically have they been doing to be one of the growing unions? At least, I know they're not growing currently, but in the last couple decades they grew.
Yeah, there was... After the last presidential election, there was a Wall Street Journal piece talking about what SEIU does in terms of their finances, and one of their officers pretty much said they go all in during the presidential campaign, and then in the off years work to rebuild their finances, indicating that they are heavily spending money to elect candidates that will seek to expand the size and scope of government.
Hand them different franchises of different groups that ought to be represented, that whether they like it or not.
Yes, I mean they've even gone to extremes of mortgaging, their headquarters building to get tens of millions of dollars to dump into campaign work.
Huh.
So that's they definitely see this as a means to survival, and are like you said, doubling down on it, and and for good reason. When you look at the private sector economy, it's a lot more difficult to convince up and coming employees in today's world that unions are necessary.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know a lot of millennials that are looking to join unions.
Right.
Certainly people that are looking to move around a little bit. In today's world, you don't have the same kind of major blue chip employers that you used to, where people would work 30, 40 years for one employer, get the gold watch, and retire.
Mm-hmm.
People work 3-5 years at one spot, and they bounce around a lot. That's kind of how today's economy works.
And the 401k lets them have their sort of long-term accommodations travel with them. And in the past, unions often were the provider of the pension situation, at least on the private sector side.
Yes, they certainly were, yes.
So now, as far as what they're trying to protect and why they're so aggressively trying to grow into these other areas, what is the nature of their infrastructure? What do they have a lot of employees and all of that? I mean, what's that look like?
Sure. Their national headquarters has a budget of close to $300 million a year. They have hundreds of employees. They have a massive building in downtown D.C. that's it's worth tens of millions of dollars. I believe it's over $80 million, I believe. And that's just their national headquarters. And then if you look at
we
all
have
of
multitudes of locals in the state.
Right, the state affiliates, the local councils and chapters and all that. Mm-hmm. It's a big, massive organization, and it takes a lot of money to keep that kind of infrastructure going. Mm-hmm. So that's obviously a reason behind the push to expand into new industries where they haven't been able to traditionally make inroads.
And the employees of the union obviously have a keen interest in protecting their own jobs by making sure the cash flow stays the same or grows, especially if they want to advance or increase in their own pay. My understanding is the nature of salaries for union officials is on the generous side, but any comments on that? Or?
Oh, sure, it certainly is. You can go to the Labor Department's website, which is unionreports.gov, and search for SEIU in their various component parts, and see that yes, their officers and employees are well compensated. In many instances, compensated higher than you would see if they were working for a for-profit entity. So they definitely take care of their own.
Yeah. Now, one other thing that I was curious about, since you're certainly paying attention to the SEIU things and kind of how the growth goes, I have noticed a real fixation that the SEIU as an organization, or at least some of our locals do, on the immigrant community. And this is intriguing because it sort of harkens back to the original days where, the Irish would come over and they would get plugged into a union who would plug them into jobs, and it was all sort of I don't know. Everything was kind of on rails. But what is going on? Why are they advocating on issues like immigration policy and some of that? What's the development there?
Well, there is kind of a split in the union movement as a whole as to whether that's a good idea or not.
Because I know a lot of union voices are saying, stop, build the borders, let's keep jobs at home. They're not that way, though. They're in
Right.
the other camp?
For those unions that represent employers in industries such as manufacturing, which would be at the higher end of the pay scale than most SEIU employees or SEIU members, I think there's a difference of opinion there. With SEIU, again, they're looking for employees that they can represent and not necessarily, or employees that they can get money from and not necessarily have to do a lot of work on the representation side. This is not a new trend. I've seen this for, at least 10 years, that they have been advocating for increased immigration, on the hopes that it gets them, more employees. At the same time, other unions are complaining or at least advocating that this would, lead to a decrease in wages because you're increasing the supply, the labor supply. So, there's definitely a split there, but SEIU definitely believes that this will benefit their bottom line, otherwise they wouldn't be doing it.
Sure. And I noticed, too, that they have, in our state, a heavy emphasis on getting special training arrangements where, okay, you're going to be a health care provider or a home health provider, which is often, a lot of times immigrants will find their way into that work. And, oh, by the way, you must get trained by us as many times as it requires for you to pass. And we get paid every time you get trained, regardless of how you do. There's a lot of shadiness going on there, in my opinion. But have you looked into any of the sort of the training rackets and some of the where they get contracts from the government to do things?
Yeah, it's a new slice of a way to do it, but it's definitely been an old problem. The training funds have been around since the time that the big three automakers were the really big deal in this country, and this is kind of a carryover from that.
Right. Okay, well, listen, we're out of time, but I really appreciate you joining us and filling us in on your SEIU Monitor project. Nathan Mehrens of Americans for Limited Government Foundation. If people want to follow what you're doing, get on your mailing list, what website do you recommend?
Go to netrightdaily.com for our general list and SEIUmonitor.com to keep tabs on the SEIU.
Excellent. Well, listen, I appreciate you joining us. And folks, let me remind you that if you ever have questions of me or things that we've talked about, feel free to contact us at the Freedom Foundation. The number 360-956-3482. And I appreciate you joining us on Freedom Daily, your daily dose of freedom.